Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be giving you my best and worst books of the first quarter of 2020. Now I'm going to be rating these in two separate ways. I'm going to be doing them first, best and worst, in terms of ratings that I've given my books. So in terms of 5-star, 1-star, etc. And then I'm going to be rating the books based on how I felt about them, how they impacted me. So for the best books, it's the books that I'm really glad that I read. Even if I didn't enjoy it, I'm glad that I read the book. And then for the worst books, it will be a case of books that really let me down. Either I had really good expectations for them, or the ending or something just ruined it completely and they let me down. Even if I gave them a decent rating, maybe they just let me down in some aspects, and that would class it as one of the worst books that I've read. Not necessarily in terms of rating, just in terms of how it made me feel. So I'm going to start with my ratings because they're the ones that realistically that's how I've rated them, so they are technically the best and worst books that I've read. So I'll start there. So in no particular order, the best books in terms of ratings are all 5-star books. I read 6 5-star books this year and I'm rating in 5, the top 5. So the first one, as I'm sure you could probably guess, is The Host. Now I absolutely love The Host. I thought it was great and it carried such a message and it impacted me. I'm not going to go all about it again. Check out some of my other videos discussing The Host, especially the review and the book to movie comparison for that. But that was a great book and it got a 5-star, so cannot fault it. Now the second book that I absolutely loved was To All the Boys I Loved Before. And I like that for other reasons. I thought that was one of the best books I'd read in terms of ratings because it was a romance. I read it via audiobook, so that was two of the things I hate. I hate romance, I don't do audiobooks, and somehow this book still managed to convince me to fall in love with it, and I can't wait to read the rest, so that got a 5-star from me. Then, what is it? I See You by Claire Mackintosh. Claire Mackintosh is now an Instabuy author for me because of the quality of the writing that I've read of her so far. I've read 2 books by her, I See You, which I read this year, and then I Let You Go, which was an older book that I've read, and I absolutely loved it. It had a good twist and turn, it was very thrilling, it was very dark, and I absolutely adored it, and it got a 5-star from me. Then the next book is Elevator Pitch by Linwood Barclay, and that got a 5-star from me. It felt a bit slow to begin with, but it picked up and it ended in an amazing twist and I loved it, and it got a 5-star. So that's really the point why I'm doing it in 2 separate ways, because all I'm saying, it was a great book, it got 5 stars from me, and I don't really know what else to say about it, so that's why I split it up in 2 ways. Hi guys, Editing Connor here. Just to let you know, because I'm a massive moron, I only gave you my top 4 books and missed one off. So, just a little insert here to let you know that my number 5 best rated books in terms of ratings is In an Instant. And I absolutely loved the book. It is one of my favourite books, if not the best book of the year for me up to now. And it deserves to be in this list. Otherwise I would have just put a little note in saying sorry I forgot, but I felt as though I had to discuss it with you. And I love the book, y'all know I love the book. You should really just check and look at any sort of review I've done for it, because I would 100% recommend buying it. So buy it, definitely, and I'm sorry that I was an idiot and forgot to include it. So continue on with the video. Now the worst books for me, I want to make a quick disclaimer for you before I talk about the worst books in terms of ratings. I'm not including books I've DNF'd because I don't see any logical reason to include those books, because I didn't finish those books, so I can't really justifiably say that they were the worst books I've read. I just might not have enjoyed them, I might never enjoy them, but the point is I haven't read the full book, so I can't give a well-balanced reason as to why it was one of the worst books I've read, because I didn't care enough to actually finish it. So This is going in terms of ratings from 1 star upwards and excluding DNFs. So, again, in no particular order, one of the worst books I've read this year in terms of my ratings was The Shade of Hetty Danes. Now, I read this book when I first started reading, so when I was around 13 years old, and it was a book that I read in school, and I really enjoyed it. Now I reread it because I found it and I was like, oh, I remember reading this. I loved it. I'm going to do it again. And I read it, and it was definitely written for a young person, and it was written for somebody who perhaps doesn't read that often, which is why I probably liked it at that time. But upon a reread, I hated it. It was awful. The writing was so bad. The story was okay, but the dialogue that was in it, like some of the conversations they had, it was just stupid. It felt tacky. So I wasn't a fan. Hated it. Gave it 2 stars. Then the next book I gave a 2-star rating was Airport Code Red by James Patterson. And I just didn't like it. I've said before in some of my previous things, like the wrap-ups and weekly vlogs where I've discussed this, it wasn't a bad book. It just discussed a theme of ex-armed forces people and terrorist cells, and they're not really themes that interest me, so I wasn't really enjoying reading the book. I just kind of got through it. So it wasn't for me. Might be for other people, and I hope that people read it and absolutely love it. I just know that it is definitely not the type of book that I would typically read. So it got a low star rating, and that got 2 stars. Then comes the book that I am very angry about. And that is Come Again. And that was written by Robert Webb. That got a 2-star rating. I've only very recently finished this month. I hated it. It was such a good book, and it was such a good build-up, and then the last part of the book basically just tore it down and ruined it. And I'm angry. But I will discuss that a bit later on. Then I am on to 3-star books. Now this was a bit harder to establish because the 2-star books in terms of ratings was easy. Then when it comes to 3 stars, I had quite a few 3-star books, so which ones deserve to go in the final 2? So I went in terms of when I read them in the year rather than any sort of like or dislike, because I wanted to base it purely on ratings. So I had The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which in terms of ratings, it got a 3-star. Didn't dislike the book. It wasn't well written. The story was very good. It just wasn't well written, so it got a lower rating from me than perhaps it should have, or maybe it could have. But it just didn't appeal to me. I didn't like it, so it got a low star rating. But I read that in January, which is why it got this rating. Then I read Daddy Needs a Date, and that got a 3-star rating because it wasn't anything spectacular. It was actually angry. It was one of those books that, despite all of the issues I had, I kind of enjoyed reading it. And I have to say kind of, because looking back on it, I'm thinking, why did I put myself through it? But at the time, every time I put it down, I was like, kind of want to pick it back up. But it was awful. God awful book. So they are my best and worst books in terms of ratings. Now I'm going to discuss the best books that I've read in terms of how they made me feel. How the fact that I'm glad I read them, and whether they still stick with me even if they weren't good books. So I'm going to go, this one is in order. So from number 5, one of the best books I've read was on my worst ratings list, and it is The Tattooist of Auschwitz. Because as much as I didn't like how the story was written, it was a very impactful story. It told the story of some of the people in the camp, the fact it was based on a true story. It focused very much on the romance, so it wasn't like a horrifying experience of focusing on life in the camp, but it did get some elements of it in there. Like, I broke my heart towards the end when certain characters experienced things. Some characters died, some characters got tortured. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to mention any characters in particular, but it hurt to read about. And knowing that it was a real story and that these characters existed, it it stuck with me, and it was one of the best books in terms of I'm so glad I read it because it gave me more of an understanding. And it wasn't well written, and I don't really like historical fiction books, but the fact that this story was told meant a lot to me, and I am glad that I read it. Now, fourth was I See You, and it was a great book. I've already mentioned that I loved it. I gave it 5 stars, but it was a good book because I'm so glad I read it, because I was in a reading slump at that point, or I was just getting into one, and I'd not read thrillers. I kind of tried expanding my genres. I read The Hobbit, which was a fantasy. I've read... What else have I read? I read a lot of books. The Hobbit was the only one I remember reading because I was kind of reading the other one at the same time. I was kind of reading I See You at the same time. I'd read The Hobbit, I'd been reading romance, I'd been really trying to expand the genres I read and not sticking with thrillers. And I was getting into a bit of a slump because thrillers are my genre. I love a thriller book. And kind of felt as though I'd neglected that. Unintentionally, I didn't mean to, but I did. And reading it took me back to thrillers. It reminded me why I love thrillers so much. And it just kind of renewed my faith in reading, in a sense of, I know what I like. I know where I stand. I know what I am. And it's not... I think I've just tried so much to read more books and expand my genres that I kind of forgot where I originally lie. And I know where I want to read more. I love thrillers and I want to stick with them, and I want to make sure I read more thrillers. So it's kind of just made me realise that I shouldn't neglect reading thrillers just because that's what I'm used to, and I should expand, because you got to go with what your heart says, and my heart loves a thriller. So I'm so glad I read the book, because it really did make me realise what I need to do to be happy with my reading. I swear to God, I'm so sorry about my hair, honestly. Now, third on the list, I'm so glad I read The Hobbit. Now, that got a 3-star rating for me, and I thought it was a good book, and really, I'm glad I read it, because it's been on my TBR for a long time with The Lord of the Rings, and I've never wanted to read them because I've never known if I'm going to like them, and it's such a beloved series that I was always too scared to pick it up, and I just assumed if I never read it, never picked it up, it wouldn't make a difference. And I had to read The Hobbit because I took part in the Royal Weekender for the Bookie Trials, and it was the only one really that fit the genre, and it was a smallish book so that it kind of fit in the time frame. So I read it, and whilst it did not get a 5-star, it was a 5-star prediction, but whilst it did not, it only got 3. I'm so glad I read it because it's made me realise that it was fun and I enjoyed it. As much as I didn't love it and it's not my favourite, I did enjoy it, and I think I can get through it. And I think I know The Lord of the Rings are much heavier and darker and not as quite free-spirited and fun as The Hobbit was, but I do really like J.R.R. Tolkien's writing style, and I do look forward to reading The Lord of the Rings now. So that's why it got a spot on the list, because I'm so glad I read it. Even though it wasn't the best book, I'm so glad I read it. Now, second is one of my old faithfuls, James Patterson, and it was The People versus Alex Cross. Now, I've mentioned before, a lot of people know when it comes to James Patterson, I love him. But Alex Cross is my series. I love Alex Cross. He is one of James... I think he is the longest James Patterson character. He has 29 books now, I think, or 27, and then 2 shorter books. It's a long series, and it's the longest series going, and I absolutely love it. Alex Cross, the book series, is written only by James Patterson. It's the books that got me really into James Patterson, and I did fall completely in love with it. He's a great character, Alex Cross, and reading The People versus Alex Cross, it was the first book of Alex Cross that I read this year, and it's home for me, and I love it, and it got me right back into it, and I thought, yes, this is why I love James Patterson. So that got a 4-star rating from me, and I loved it, and I'm so glad I got back there, because it just, like with I See You, I love a thriller, and it just got me thinking, why do I leave this? I know I love this. It's good to expand on genres, but stop forgetting about my thrillers. And I've not even read that many James Pattersons. Usually that's all I ever read. And now I'm lucky if I get one James Patterson in a month. So I want to go back to them. I really do. And it just kind of, it was comfy and it was home because I've been expanding so much, but Alex Cross was where my love of James Patterson and my love of thrillers really started. So I was glad to be there. Now, my number one spot, and it is a book I absolutely adore. It's a book that's only recently come out, and that is In an Instant. Now, I read this via ebook. It was an art copy, and I did love it. I loved it so much. I really want a physical copy, and I don't know why I haven't even got one yet. I just keep forgetting. And now we're in isolation, it's just harder for me to get one. But I love the book. The story, the message, just, it was so beautifully written. And then finding out that the reason the author wrote the book is because she experienced something similar when she was younger. It was just, it gut punched me. It was one of those books that grabbed me by the heart and squoze it. And it hurt. And I love it. And it was I think that is my favourite book of the year. No matter what, that is my favourite book of the year. And I think any other book in the future is going to be very hard pressed to actually beat it. Because very few books have had that much of an effect on me. And that is my favourite book. And that is one I will 100% recommend to anybody. Get this book. Now, moving on to the worst books I read this year. And that is in terms of books that I was expecting a lot from and they really let me down, books that I just felt missed the mark, and books that I just basically hated. So it's a nice range. Now, again in order, I think the first book that I hated, my worst book, well, my fifth worst book of the year, was Airport Code Red. It just wasn't for me, but it was a James Patterson book and I went into it expecting to love it, and I think because I go into books blind a lot of the time, I didn't know what to expect and it just missed the mark for me, and that's really all I can say about it. Then fourth was Our Little Cruelties. Now I gave this a 4-star book and I did enjoy the book. There was just a lot of issues with it and it did let me down because I expected a lot from it. Like, the storyline was fairly solid and I expected a really consistent and good storyline, but it was in a non-linear structure which was pointless because it didn't make any sense to the plot to do it that way, but the author chose to do it that way and I just wasn't a big fan of that. Then I felt as though the ending was just a bit of a cop-out because it built it up. Again, I'm trying to not spoil this. It built it up as though it was going to be this one massive, really dramatic conclusion where these brothers ended up fighting to the death, and that wasn't the case. One of them did die, but it wasn't this big dramatic conclusion that I felt as though we was pretty much promised to get, and it didn't happen. Then, third, I was really let down by Annihilation. This was chosen by a viewer, and the plot was so interesting, and it was so new, and I thought, I'm really going to love this. And it was so solid. I was ready to get into it. And I felt as though the first half of the book gave me what I wanted. And then the second half, it just kind of died down. She started talking very scientifically and going on about things. And I was like, it just kind of took away from the story. I didn't fully understand what was going on. And yeah, it let me down because I expected more. That's really all I'm going to say about these books. They let me down. And then second was The Stranger. Now, I have a full reason of why The Stranger let me down, so check out that video if you want a lot of information. Basically, The Stranger let me down because I watched the TV show first and I fell in love with the TV show. And the TV show added things that made the book better. And the book was just lacking in certain areas and it made no sense. So I was a bit disappointed. I really enjoyed it, but I was disappointed. And there's nothing worse than feeling disappointed in a book. At least if you hate a book or you don't like it, at least you have a good solid reason. If a book is just disappointing, then that's awful. Now, on to the worst book I read because it made me mad. And that is Come Again. Now, I spoke about this book before. I spoke about it in my wrap-up or a weekly vlog. I think it was a wrap. I don't know. I've spoken about this book. I will link the video so you can watch that if you want to. Basically, this book is about a woman who has lost her husband and she's really depressed to a point where she tries to commit suicide, or she's going to commit suicide. And then she ends up waking up in the body of her 18-year-old self. And it is the first day she ever meets her husband. And she decides this time around she's going to save his life. Now that sounded like a really fun kind of cliche plot, but it changed it around a bit. It was a lot of fun. I was all for it. I could not wait. And then it messed up. Now, I'm not spoiling it because the book's only just coming out, so it feels unfair for me to trash a book that's only just coming out. But then I think at the same time, whether it's only just come out or whether it's been out 10 years, I'm angry with it and I'm not happy with it. So if you want to read it, great. Just be prepared that the last part, because it's in three parts, the last part of the book ruins everything. So I'm mad. I'm really mad. But yeah, up to now, they are my best and worst books of this quarter of 2020. So hopefully you enjoyed them. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought. If you haven't read any of these books and you want to, check them out. They're really good or they're really bad. We'll see. And that is all from me. I post every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday and then intermittently through the week. So until next time, see you later.